Republicans in Congress are threatening federal judges almost every single day. Representative Dan Goldman is here to discuss this and how we fight back to protect our democracy. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Representative Goldman, welcome back to Defending Democracy.
Thanks for having me again, Mark.
All right. So I needed you on because we are now in the middle of various legal crises, constitutional crises, judicial crises, and you are my go-to, not just member of Congress, but real life practicing superstar lawyer. So you're going to help me sort through all of this. So I want to start with what is, I think, in some ways, the least serious and also the most serious of the problems that I see us facing right now, which is that your Republican colleagues are now routinely attacking the federal judiciary, and they're doing it across a multiple of fronts. I mean, they're doing it around individual judges, threatening impeachment, for example, of Judge Boasberg in Washington, D.C. They are even threatening to perhaps reconfigure the federal judiciary in its entirety. I don't know if they're going to go back to the days where we just have a Supreme Court and like they have original jurisdiction and we don't have district courts. But how much should we worry about the rhetoric coming out of Republicans in the House and Republicans more generally about the judiciary and judges?
I think we should worry a lot more about the rhetoric than the actual actions that they are just talking about taking. Impeachment's a non-starter. I don't think they could pass an impeachment resolution in the House, and given that you need 67 senators, it's dead on arrival, and it would just be performative at this point to do that. But just the continued attacks and the continued threats are incredibly dangerous. One of the things that Donald Trump has successfully done over the last 8 years is undermine the credibility of the FBI and the Department of Justice by persistently and falsely attacking both. And that has done damage to the rule of law in this country. And it's done damage to the credibility of our law enforcement. And we now have a broad acceptance of the weaponization of the federal government by Republicans. And we know that because they're projecting it onto Democrats as their typical way of dealing with their own wrongdoing is to accuse the other side of doing it. Now what we're seeing is the only bulwark, the only guardrail against absolute anarchy and authoritarianism right now is the courts. The House Republicans, the Senate Republicans have completely abdicated any of their own authority and their own obligation to conduct oversight of the executive branch. And so judges are following the law for the most part, and that's not okay for Trump and the administration, because their job is not to follow the law. Their job is to rubber stamp whatever it is that Donald Trump wants to do, because as they repeatedly say, he was elected president, as if somehow that's new and different in our system of government and our separation of powers, that he was elected, so therefore he gets to do whatever he wants. No, of course, that's not how it works. The fact of undermining the credibility means that there is always the possibility that they will disregard, which they have done in small ways, court orders, and that there won't be the outrage and uproar from the American public that I think would happen today if they were, as you say, to eliminate all district courts.
So then what is Jim Jordan doing? I know you are on the House Judiciary Committee. My understanding is there is a meeting there. I don't know if it's a hearing or what it is, but there's some formal proceeding that he is going to chair on this topic. What do you think it's about?
Well, I'm actually very interested to see whether he's going to chair it or not, because notably, it's a joint subcommittee hearing.
Okay.
And the one thing I will say about Jim Jordan is I have a lot of issues. I have a lot of objections to him, but he has, I wouldn't be at all surprised if he wants to stay away from this.
Hmm,
And that's why it's a
interesting.
subcommittee hearing and not a full committee hearing.
So if it's too crazy for Jim Jordan, who are the Republicans who might fill in?
Well, one is Chip Roy,
Well, there you
who
go.
certainly is going to be crazier than Jim Jordan. The other is Darrell Issa, who is the one
Huh.
who has the bill to prohibit nationwide injunctions by district court judges. Now, you and I both know, of course, that Republicans have
Yes.
figured out a backdoor way to get nationwide injunctions on any issue that they don't like. And there is a particular judge in the Eastern District of Texas who's the only judge in his region. And so they file the cases there, Judge Kazmarek, and pretty much across the board, he will agree with whatever the Republican interest groups want to do. But there's the other thing I find interesting, and I think you will too, Mark, is we keep hearing from Republicans about how many nationwide injunctions
Right.
district courts have issued in Trump's first 2 months, and that is far more than what Biden had in his full 4 years. The thing that strikes me, and what I have said publicly, is stop breaking the law, and you won't get so many nationwide injunctions. But I am worried because I do think we enter a true constitutional crisis when the administration just defies court orders and disregards efforts to enforce those court orders, because the courts and the judges will try to enforce them. And that's when I think all bets are off.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've written about this. I've spoken about this. I think that we hit a constitutional crisis when the administration is not playing cat and mouse with court orders, right? Like it's one thing that they're acting in bad faith, but they are claiming they are abiding by them, even though they are not. That is where we are. That's not great by any stretch of the imagination, but I think at the point in which they just say, yeah, that's a nice order you have there, Your Honor, but we're simply not going to follow it, then I think we're in a very, very different circumstance. And I think the way that tees up is probably through contempt, right? A judge says, I think you're in contempt. The judge holds them in contempt, tries to impose a penalty. The executive branch simply says, no, we're not going to abide the penalty, whatever it may be. And then I think that is probably the clearest way. Because otherwise, Donald Trump seems to want to say he follows court orders. I'm not quite sure why he says it, but I think it's through contempt that this winds up getting teed up.
Yeah, or there's just no government attorney who shows,
Well,
and
that's
there's
also, yeah,
default judgment, and they just ignore it.
that's also true. Well, that's grim. Let's pick up on that thought, because the other topic I wanted to talk to you about is the state of lawyers showing up. We have seen two phenomena take place. One is on the government side, where as someone who regularly reads the signature pages, you are seeing more and more senior DOJ officials appearing and signing briefs that one wouldn't expect them to, and fewer career lawyers being willing to sign briefs. Then on the other side, you have a lot of cowardice going on in the private law firm arena. And you are seeing a lot of big law firms back away from even being willing to take on clients. This has been widely reported. They are afraid that they'll be targeted by Donald Trump. We have seen a handful of law firms already targeted by Donald Trump. We have seen a group of lawyers, myself included, targeted by Donald Trump. And I have been surprised. That so few lawyers and law firms have been willing to just look at it straight on and say, you're not going to intimidate me, and we're going to keep fighting. So I'm curious on both sides, since you have been on both sides of this equation. Like, what do you make of the fact that they may simply run out of government lawyers willing to be on briefs, and the fact that you may have no private lawyers willing to bring certain kinds of cases and represent certain kinds of clients?
It is tremendously concerning, and not just for the legal profession. So let's be clear about that. First of all, I want to give you a tremendous amount of gratitude and appreciation for so clearly standing up to the efforts by Donald Trump to intimidate you. Our mutual friend Norm Eisen is another one who has been called out and name checked directly. And as a true good lawyer that you both are, it only steels your resolve. And certainly that's the way I feel here in Congress.
I'll be right back with more of my conversation with Representative Goldman in a moment. I founded Democracy Docket because I know the power of the courts have to protect our elections. Please support Democracy Docket today by subscribing to its free daily newsletters at the link above or in the show notes below.
You're right to point out both sides. I actually had George Terwilliger, who was an old former deputy attorney general under Bill Barr in the first Bush George H.W. Bush administration. And he was testifying in the Judiciary Committee. And I asked him, because it was right around the time that Emile Bove, who was then the acting deputy attorney general, appeared for the United States in the Southern District of New York. And I asked Terwilliger, I said, did you ever appear in court as a deputy attorney general? The answer, of course, is no. No deputy attorney general would ever in a million years get close to a courtroom because, I mean, there must be 12 layers between the deputy attorney general and a line prosecutor, a career prosecutor. But the reason was nobody would appear, right? Because what they were doing was so anathema to the ethics, to their rules and regulations, to the values, the mores, everything that a prosecutor stands for and the Department of Justice used to stand for was being violated. And now we are seeing it more and more and more. And so your point, I think, is very astute and under discussed, which is, as you see more and more political appointees signing briefs and appearing on behalf of the United States for the Department of Justice, you are seeing a increasingly politicized and weaponized Department of Justice, which is certainly something you and I warned about for a long time. There's a significant concern about Kash Patel being, FBI director when he has made threats to weaponize the FBI. And this is it's a small point, but it is yet another example of how Donald Trump is politicizing all of the federal government to operate on his behalf, not on behalf of the United States, behalf of the Constitution, or behalf of the rule of law, which is, of course, what everybody's obligation and oath is to do.
Yeah, and I want to give you credit for opening my eyes on something, and it's a point I have made to a lot of people, and I always make sure to give you credit, that, if you are a Republican and you care a lot about law and order, and you care a lot about crime, you actually don't want a legal system in which people can say that every prosecution is potentially politically motivated, right? Like in some ways, and I'd never really thought about it this way until you articulated it, that it makes the line prosecutor's job harder in kind of both ways. Like, one of the ways it makes it harder is that when your boss says we are doing basically political things, and it is clear your boss is doing political things, when you, a line prosecutor, are not doing political things, you will still have people say, well, this must be political, right? So it actually undermines even the legitimate prosecutions that everybody agrees, including the law and order crowd, thinks are really important to go forward.
Well, that's right. And the corollary to that is, if you're a trial lawyer, and especially you represent the government, and so
Right.
much of a trial is credibility. And we would have these discussions all the time. If there was a witness who we believed, because we've never put anybody up there, but who had real issues and had credibility issues that a jury would find, it wasn't just whether or not the jury was going to find that witness credible. If we put a witness on the stand saying to the jury, we believe in this evidence, and they find that that witness is not credible, it has spillover prejudice against every other witness that you put up. And that's exactly the same problem that we're encountering here. And it happens on the flip side too. And this is really where I'm worried is, look, it's, admirable that you and Norm and a few others are really, and Perkins Coie are standing up to what is such obvious improper conduct and abuse of power. But what is scary is that without collective action from every law firm in the country or every media organization in the country to stand up and defend the AP from what is clearly a First Amendment violation and viewpoint discrimination, then everyone will start eating each other. And Donald Trump will be able to pick off one by one by one by one and intimidate many others into obeying in advance his improper objectives. And it is essential that those who believe in the rule of law, those who believe in democracy, be willing to stand up, even risking, a business development and business revenues if it's a corporation. But if we are not all standing up for what we know to be right, it will decay and erode our entire system. And so maybe the law firm lives another day with their current clients. But when our entire system breaks down and law firms are now irrelevant, you will die another day. And so if we allow the erosion of our fundamental rights and our fundamental values by caving to Donald Trump on an individualized basis, we allow the full erosion of the rule of law and of our democracy. And that is the foundation for our entire economy. One business may not think, one corporation may not think it is relevant to itself, except for the fact that if we don't have the rule of law, if contracts are no longer binding, if agreements can just be canceled by the government and therefore by any counterparty because the government is doing it, then everything goes to hell in a handbasket. And if people don't realize that the only way to fight that is collective action and standing unified against this improper behavior, we are much more likely to descend into that disaster.
Yeah, I want to put a little bit of a sharper point on it and see if you agree, or if at least you agree with my conclusion. You may not agree with all the places I go in between, but I think it's actually worse than that. I mean, the fact is that, law firms are not corporations. I think what the media has done with AP is shameful. Like I've said that, I've said that they are exactly doing what you said. But I actually think what the legal profession doing is worse than that, because lawyers are not just in another business, right? They're not just like in the selling ads business or the whatever, large media conglomerates are. They take they have an obligation that extends beyond their own economic self-interest. In fact, as you know, as a lawyer, one of the first things you learn is that your own interest has to be secondary. Not only isn't it the only consideration, it can't even be the primary consideration, right? That you always have to put your client's interests ahead of your own. And you have an independent obligation to the bar, to the court rather, right? You have an obligation of candor to the court. You have an obligation as an officer of the court to respect certain certain protocols and certain procedures and certain obligations that, again, may disadvantage you, but which are above you. And in exchange for that, in exchange for doing those things, you essentially get an exemption from the antitrust laws, right? You essentially get to do something that no one else gets to do, which is to make a living by practicing law. And it feels like what we have seen the law firms do is they take that second part, that economic part, and they set aside all of the first things. I mean, every time I've ever been up against a federal prosecutor, and I sometimes agree with them and oftentimes I disagree with them, depending on the case, but it is always clear that they are holding themselves to an obligation that is not just to win. It is not just their business interest. There is something higher than that. And that is true for government lawyers, but it is also true for private lawyers. And what we have seen is a lot of lawyers sort of set all of that aside and look at it just as a question of dollars and cents. So yes, there is a collective action problem, for sure. There is also just a courage problem, for sure. But there is also a professional ethics problem. And that's the thing that I think so oftentimes gets lost out of this. And the reason why I started with the both sides of the equation is I think it has been lost, frankly, by the most senior lawyers at the Department of Justice. I think Pam Bondi has lost it. I think Beauvais has lost it. I think others, like, they are not doing the thing that government lawyers are supposed to put paramount. But I'd also say on the private bar, there are too many of these lawyers and law firms that are also not doing the thing that they are supposed to do with respect to upholding the best in the legal profession. So you may not agree with all of that, but I wonder if at least you think that there is a kernel there.
No, I do. It's not my business, but certainly I have plenty of friends and former colleagues at law firms. And there's no question that over the last 10 years in particular, but really going back, 30 years, law firms have evolved from, a partnership, from a profession to a business, and it's now much more of a business than it ever has been before. And so I think what is very much driving, you see a lot more movement, right, between law firms of partners, and they'll take a higher bidder if they can get poached. What's dangerous is you have all these law firms who see a fellow law firm in distress, so to speak, and they go after their clients.
Right.
That is inexcusable. And that's where I think your point about a higher degree of ethics and professional responsibility should come in. You do not, as a law firm, I mean, it's the old saying, it might be, Paul Weiss today, but it could be Sullivan Cromwell tomorrow. And you have to be sure that you're not looking too narrowly at the picture.
While I've got you just for a few more minutes, I've got to turn to the most recent executive order because it is a breathtakingly sweeping assertion of executive power that he simply does not have. I mean, I guess you might say, welcome to all of his executive orders. But the idea that the President of the United States thinks he can essentially restructure our elections, he can essentially aggregate to himself power that belongs in the Constitution itself to the states and to Congress by name, Congress, that he can aggregate, he can say, I am going to decide what the election rules are. To me, and here I want you to put on your lawyer hat, but really also your political prognosticator hat. To me, this just shows how worried he is about the 2026 midterms. That you're right, the courts right now are standing up to him. But the thing he really worries about, and this is what I genuinely believe, and I wrote about this in Democracy Docket, but I think it's exactly, I have as much conviction about this as anything else. He is worried that Democrats are going to retake the House in 2026. And it is one thing for Jim Jordan to have a gavel. It's one thing for Andy Biggs to have a gavel. It is a whole other kettle of fish for Jamie Raskin and Dan Goldman to have gavels. It is a whole other kettle of fish if you guys are in a position to do oversight or to set or to enact legislation, to send, to move legislation forward. And so to me, he is brittle. He is weak in the area of elections because he knows that what he's doing right now is not popular. He knows that, you look at the recent election for state legislature in Pennsylvania, where a Democrat won in a seat that Democrats have not won in over a century. And he is afraid. And so what he is trying to do is to, he's always been an election denier. He's always been a vote suppressor, but that he is trying to lay the groundwork now to try to make it harder to vote going into 2026, make it easier for Republicans to hold power in the midterms. And I wonder if that's your perspective on this executive order, or you just think it's just another, like, Donald Trump, I called his executive order performance art. Like, it doesn't read like a legal document. It reads like it's just like he dictated it and it got put on paper.
Well, in our last discussion about law firms, you made the point you thought it was a little bit more nefarious and a little bit deeper than what I was saying. I'm going to flip that on its head with you. I think this has less to do with the 2026 elections and is much more consistent and in line with what is very clearly an effort for Donald Trump to take over the federal government. And you can call it a dictatorship, you can call it authoritarianism, you can call it, tyrannicism, fascism, whatever you want. But the idea is that Donald Trump is trying to absolutely eliminate our democracy. And I'm sure some of your listeners are going to be like, oh, this is so, let's not overstate it. Let's not do it. Well, let's take a look at the things that he's done. First of all, pardoned every single January 6th defendant. Mm-hmm. He has now created
every single one of them. Every one of them, right? The ones who assaulted cops, all of them.
I mean, there were about 500 who were convicted either because they admitted it or a jury found them guilty of assaulting law enforcement officers from the party that ostensibly is all about law enforcement and backing the blue. But what that did is it created a violent militia that will operate at the direction of Donald Trump. He then installed the most unqualified, unmeritorious, the irony of hearing Pete Hegseth say that the Department of Defense is going to focus just on merit-based hiring when he is so far and away the most unqualified Secretary of Defense ever. It burns me up. But he puts in these hacks, these lackeys who he knows are totally beholden to him, and that's their only qualification to take over the FBI, to take over our national intelligence, to take over our Department of Defense. Okay, so now he's got all the powerful vessels of government at his control. So what else? Well, there are independent inspectors general at a lot of these agencies who can cause some problems for him because they are removed from the political appointees of those agencies. But let's just fire all of them. Oh, and then the one that we didn't fire who actually came out with a report that was critical, I don't like that report, I'm going to fire him. Okay, now they're going after judges. He is going after every single form of accountability and democracy. And what he is laying the foundation for is a complete usurpation of power. He threatens senators with primaries, with Elon Musk putting hundreds of millions of dollars in order for them to vote against their own knowledge and instincts to support his unqualified candidates. Congress has just completely caved to him, given all Article 1 power, all congressional authority over to Trump. And that's why he's going after the judiciary. It's the last check. But so this is just yet another step in his effort he's not going to declare himself a dictator. He's going to try to do exactly what Vladimir Putin has done. There still are ostensibly elections in Russia.
Yep.
Right? But they're bogus. We know that. And so that's what he is laying the foundation to try to do. And even if he knows that this executive order is completely lawless, is completely baseless, and is far outside of his authority, what he has realized from other executive orders, that some of which we discussed, is that even if there's no basis in law for him to do it, he can intimidate people into submit to his will. And so you'll go to court on this executive order. A lot of other people will go to court, and the law is on your side. But even if you win, he has sent a message, and he has laid down a marker that he's coming after the people who administer our elections. And it may not be as drastic as what his executive order says, but he is going to chip away at our elections. because he just simply does not want to face the voters. And that's why I think he is pushing forward with such an outrageous executive order.
Representative Dan Goldman, you are always my first go-to whenever we have the troubled problems of Donald Trump and the law and Congress. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Defending Democracy. Please stay informed on the latest voting rights and democracy news by signing up to our free newsletters. We'll see you next time.